On December 29th, China's military surrounded Taiwan, threatening an invasion. Over 130 Chinese aircraft and 20 warships moved into position, opening fire in the largest military exercise China has ever conducted around the island. The Chinese military called the 2D operation Justice Mission 2025, with the goal of deterring Taiwan's independence.
坚决反对台独分裂行径和外部势力干涉。
This was the sixth major Chinese military exercise around Taiwan since 2022. But Justice Mission 2025 was different, and not in the way Taiwan was prepared for. Its ships stayed very close to Taiwan's coast, inside waters Taiwan considers its own. In some areas, they came within about 10 kilometers of the shoreline. That's extremely aggressive. I mean, at that distance, you could likely see the ships from the coast and hear the aircraft overhead. The impact was immediate. More than 80 domestic flights were cancelled, and over 300 international flights were delayed or rerouted. Many Taiwanese fishermen couldn't even go out to sea. I'm going to explain why this happened and why what China just practiced may be far more dangerous for Taiwan than an invasion. The trigger for this military exercise came just days earlier. On December 17th, the United States approved an $11 billion arms sale to Taiwan, the largest package it had ever offered to the island.
针对台独势力的不断挑衅以及美国大规模对台售武，我们当然要坚决反对，有力反制。
But here's the key. This wasn't like usual weapons sales the US had made to Taiwan in the past. Yes, at $11 billion, it was bigger than any previous deal. But what really alarmed China was what that money was buying. In the past, American weapons sent to Taiwan focused mainly on defense. Things like air defense and coastal systems, weapons designed to protect Taiwan's beaches if China tried to invade. This package went further. Some of the systems included, like HIMARS rocket launchers, can fire missiles up to 300 kilometers. That's far enough to hit targets on the Chinese mainland. From Beijing's point of view, these weren't just defensive weapons anymore. They were weapons that could strike back across the Taiwan Strait. And there was another part of the deal that stood out. Alongside the weapons, the US also approved software that would link Taiwan's military systems directly with American command systems. In simple terms, Taiwan wouldn't just be using US-made weapons. Its military would be operating more closely with the US military, sharing information and coordinating with each other. From Beijing's perspective, that changed everything. The US wasn't just helping Taiwan defend itself anymore. It was tightening military integration with the island and directly threatening China. 11 days later, China responded with a warning to the US to back off. It launched Justice Mission 2025, its largest military exercise ever around Taiwan, pushing Chinese forces closer to the island than ever before. So, will the new $11 billion weapons package actually help Taiwan defend itself? On paper, that sounds like a total game changer. It includes rocket launchers which can strike targets on the Chinese mainland, artillery systems, anti-tank missiles, and attack drones. And with these weapons, Taiwan is trying to turn itself into what it calls a porcupine. The idea is simple. Taiwan knows it can't match China ship for ship or plane for plane. So instead, it wants to make an invasion so painful that China decides it's not worth trying. Like a predator trying to attack a porcupine. Taiwan's current president, Ching-te, has been pushing this strategy. In his New Year's speech, he said he is doubling down on boosting the island's defenses.
就可以看得出来，我们这一次军演军购的项目对台湾的国防安全是必要的。
He argued that Taiwan needs to make itself harder to swallow, strong enough to hold out until outside help arrives. But there's a serious problem with this approach. The porcupine strategy is built on one big assumption. That is, if China wants to take Taiwan, it will invade, send troops across the sea, and land forces on Taiwan's beaches. That's the kind of war that weapons Taiwan has been buying from the US are for. But look at what China actually practiced during Justice Mission 2025. It doesn't match that assumption at all. They weren't really practicing an amphibious invasion of Taiwan. Chinese warships weren't lining up off Taiwan's beaches. They weren't positioning themselves to land troops. Instead, they were blocking Taiwan's shipping lanes, the routes the island depends on to survive. Taiwan imports 97% of its energy and 70% of its food, and almost all of it arrives by ship through ports around the island. That's exactly where Chinese warships move into position. In the north, they appeared off Keelung Port, Taiwan's main gateway for supplies into the capital region. In the south, they cut across access to Kaohsiung, Taiwan's largest port, and the entry point for most of its coal, natural gas, and oil. And in the east, Chinese ships showed up for a different reason. That's where outside help would have to come from. If the US or Japan tried to send ships towards Taiwan during a crisis, those eastern sea routes are one of the main ways in. The Chinese military was very clear about what this exercise was meant to practice. They actually said it was for training for blockade of key ports and areas and for close-in containment. For the first time, China said openly that blockade, not invasion, was a main objective. This wasn't a rehearsal for an invasion. It was a preview of what a blockade will look like. And here's the uncomfortable part. What China just practiced doesn't look like the kind of war Taiwan has been preparing to fight for decades. So why is China so focused on practicing a blockade instead of an invasion? To understand why a blockade makes sense for China, you first have to understand why an invasion is such a bad idea militarily. On paper, China has a massive military, but turning that power into control over Taiwan is far harder than it looks. American analysts have run detailed simulations of a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan. In 21 out of 24 of those simulations, China failed. Not because it lacks weapons, but because getting forces onto Taiwan and keeping them supplied is incredibly difficult. To invade, China would have to move hundreds of thousands of troops across the Taiwan Strait. That's about 160 kilometers of open water. Those ships will be watched the entire time, tracked and targeted. If they could reach Taiwan, the troops wouldn't be landing on empty beaches. They'll be landing under fire, then pushing into dense cities where every street and building could hide defenders. And once Chinese troops are on the ground, the danger actually increases. They still need their food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. All of that has to cross the same stretch of open water. If those supply ships are disrupted, the troops on land get stuck, pinned in place, slowly worn down. We've seen this problem play out in the modern war in Ukraine, where Russian forces often struggle not because they lack weapons, but because moving and supplying troops under constant surveillance proved extremely hard. Modern drones and satellites meant that convoys were spotted early and hit while moving. And that's with a land border. An amphibious invasion over water makes all of these problems way worse. Every soldier, every vehicle, every shell has to arrive by ship. If that flow breaks, the invasion stalls. And once troops are stuck on an island, there's no easy way to pull them back. Then there's another risk China can't fully control: outside involvement. Of course, there's one big question: will the US step in? If the US intervenes, an invasion could quickly turn into a direct conflict between two nuclear-armed powers. And nearby countries with US bases like Japan and the Philippines would complicate things even further. That's why an invasion of Taiwan will be risky and incredibly costly, with no guarantee of success. But a blockade avoids all of these problems. China doesn't need to land a single soldier on Taiwan's beaches. Instead, it can target Taiwan's biggest weakness, its dependence on the sea. As I mentioned earlier, Taiwan imports most of its energy and food. Every shipment of oil and coal that powers homes arrives by ship. Your food, your fuel, your industrial goods, almost everything is imported. If China cuts that all off, Taiwan faces a complete shutdown. American analysts have also studied what the blockade would do to Taiwan. The island's power system is the first to fall. Coal will run out in 39 days, and natural gas 11 days. After that, the lights don't go out all at once. First come rolling blackouts, as what little power remains is being rationed. Then sustained outages as reserves run dry. Then large parts of the island go dark. Rise might last several months, but in that time, the electrical grid will be down. That means no lighting, no refrigeration, and no heating. Factories will stop running. The economy grinds to a halt. Can you imagine living in Taiwan under blockade? I mean, the people will be absolutely panicking. A blockade puts Taiwan under an insane economic and social pressure they will only build day after day without firing a single shot. Meanwhile, China can force the Taiwanese government to the negotiating table. A government that will probably be pressured by its people to do whatever it takes to end the blockade, which may mean some form of reunification with China. And you might be wondering, wouldn't Taiwan's allies step in? Well, it's a little more complicated with a blockade compared to an invasion. The US has said it will step in if Taiwan is attacked, but a blockade sits in a grey zone. It's not technically a war, so it's more difficult to justify any military intervention. China can claim it's just enforcing maritime controls or inspecting ships. Everything stays just ambiguous enough to slow down outside intervention, which becomes harder and politically riskier. Because for the outsiders, the question becomes, do you really want to start a war with China, a nuclear-armed country? Taiwan's allies can try to go through the blockade and keep Taiwan supplied, but that's also quite impossible. You can't fly or sneak in enough food and fuel for 23 million people. That's just not feasible. And that brings us back to the same weapons that were supposed to turn Taiwan into a porcupine. You might be thinking, why not just shoot the ships enforcing the blockade? This is where it gets complicated. China wouldn't rely only on obvious military warships. A blockade would likely be enforced using Coast Guard vessels and civilian fishing boats, ships flying civilian flags mixed in with normal military traffic. Taiwan can hit them, but doing so makes Taiwan look like the one escalating first, attacking vessels that can seem like civilian or law enforcement ships. That's the trap. If Taiwan doesn't respond, the blockade slowly chokes the economy. If it does respond forcefully, China can say Taiwan fired first and escalate. China is betting that Taiwan and its people won't dare to be the one that starts the war. Later on, we will look at whether Taiwanese society would actually be willing to accept the risk of that kind of conflict with China. But the core weakness of the porcupine strategy pushed by Taiwan's leaders isn't that Taiwan lacks weapons, it's that those weapons are designed for the wrong kind of war. And there's one more layer to this. Most of these weapons promised to Taiwan aren't even delivered yet. Right now, Taiwan already has more than $21 billion worth of US weapons approved but not delivered. Production delays, supply chain problems, and limited manufacturing capacity mean that many systems are arriving years late. This new $11 billion package is only adding to their backlog. Most of these weapons won't start arriving until 2027, some won't be fully delivered until close to 2030. That's quite late, and it wouldn't help much if China invaded tomorrow. But the deeper problem is this. With all of this, Taiwan has been preparing for one kind of war, while China is preparing for another type of conflict. And this is exactly what China's latest military exercise was really about. Not invading Taiwan, but rehearsing how to position ships, control the sea lanes, and cut off Taiwan's ports. And they've run these exercises 6 times now in the last 3 years, each one ending peacefully, which sounds reassuring, but ironically, it creates a dangerous pattern because people start assuming these are just provocations by China and nothing serious, until one day it actually becomes serious. After the latest drill, a teacher in Taipei told reporters,
I think these drills are just meant to scare us, to intimidate us. Similar drills have happened before.
She wasn't wrong. China has carried out exercises like this again and again, to the point that locals are not feeling the shock of Chinese ships encircling the island. It's just a piece of news that you scroll past on your phone. Taiwan's military, however, doesn't have that option. When the exercise began, it immediately scrambled fighter jets and deployed Coast Guard vessels to monitor Chinese movements. They also issued a strongly worded statement calling the drills a threatening use of force and accusing Beijing of bullying. There's a growing gap between how Taiwan's military treats such aggressive actions and how ordinary people experience them, and that gap is dangerous. Because yes, with the latest exercise, Chinese ships are returning home after it ended on December 30th, but one day they might not, and it's the real thing.
So people might feel so leaving off their guards. That is not a good news for Taiwan. We are not on our toe sometimes.
If a real blockade ever happens, the uncertainty can start pulling Taiwanese society in different directions, especially because many people are already frustrated with life in Taiwan. Outside of the booming sectors like tech, wages have barely moved, while the cost of living keeps going up. So when the government announces they are spending billions on weapons that won't arrive for years, some people, rightfully so, will start questioning the priorities.
东西在涨，薪水没有涨。那如果把这些钱对待我们的人民的话，我觉得是非常好的。我个人觉得。
And underneath that frustration is something deeper, a feeling that Taiwan is caught in the middle between China and the US.
美国就是想要维持它太平洋的霸权嘛。对。那我觉得台湾其实在美国的想法里面，它只是一颗棋子。
Polls show that Taiwanese society is divided over its long-term future, whether it be declaring independence or some form of agreement with China. This is really important because any conflict with China doesn't just test Taiwan's military strength, it tests the will of the people, how long they will be willing to live with blackouts, with shortages, with constant uncertainty, and whether they stay united when daily life starts to break down. Taiwan now faces an uncertain path, a divided society, and a China that is incredibly patient and will never let go of their dream to take Taiwan.
祖国完全统一的历史任务一定要实现，也一定能够实现。
This story isn't ending anytime soon. In future videos, I'll be breaking down the other forces shaping China-Taiwan relations. So make sure you're subscribed if you want to understand where this is all heading. But one of the biggest factors in what comes next is Japan, whose new female leader Sanae Takaichi has openly stated that Japan would defend Taiwan if China attacks. I've already made a video explaining why that creates a serious problem for China's ambitions. You can watch that right here.